want to welcome everybody back to another episode of AML Detectives. Today, I have an extremely special guest on our hands, Mike Hearns. Mike, I can't tell you how happy I am you joined me in this podcast. How's everything going?
Actually, going really good, Justin. Things are going good, and great to see you.
Good to see you.
We're all just moving forward.
I love it. I love it. So I'm curious, like, what are you up to these days? I know you've been writing books, you've been lecturing, you're teaching. So what's new in your area?
Yeah, there's been a lot going on. My third book released last week was called One More Move.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of a series of it's actually the Cade Taylor detective series.
Mm-hmm.
It's about a Miami detective who deals in money laundering. He deals in drug trafficking cases in Miami, Florida, and it's set back in the late 1990s. And the three books, the first one was Trust No One, and then it was Grasp and Smoke, and now this one More Move, has come out. And people seem to gravitate and galvanize themselves to the books, and I'm happy for that. Teaching at a small university up in Vermont as an adjunct professor, and I'm guest lecturing at some larger universities across the country, and also teaching AML, mostly to law enforcement. Haven't done a lot of financial stuff recently, but the financial door is still open.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, but just kind of on the go and just like I said earlier, just moving forward.
Sweet. So that's going to segue into my first question. You mentioned law enforcement, AML. So what makes a good AML detective?
I've been asked that before, and I've never been asked that in a formal educational setting. I get that like in bars, or I get that in social settings of friends. And truthfully, what really works is to be very geopolitical.
Mm-hmm.
You need to really understand that if there's a naval blockade off of Haiti, or if there's a telephone worker strike in Colombia, how is that going to affect the movement of currency across different countries and across different borders? And so the idea is actually really you need to be geopolitical. You can't focus on your Republican Party and your Democratic Party. You need to understand what's going on in China. You need to understand what's going on in England. You need to know what's going on elsewhere in the world. And it sounds like I'm giving you this really broad spectrum to wrap your arms around.
Mm-hmm.
But even if you're working in your 8-man police department or your 800-man, man and women person police department, you need to understand those things, because being geopolitical helps you understand what you're dealing with. And that's like the first thing I can really tell you. Of course, you need to understand, the economics of the narcotic dollar,
Mm-hmm.
but being geopolitical and being up on the world is probably your best bet.
Very cool. Very cool. Now I have a curious question. I'm going to ask you this for the audience, but I think I want to know this more. So if you could speak about a case that you worked on or you helped law enforcement with regards to AML, can you give us an example on what kind of tools were used to apprehend the criminals?
Well, there's like 19 signs of money laundering and about 17 signs of a person's personal wealth. And I had a case back in the 1990s. I recognize that that's like stagecoach era for some people, but back in the 1990s, of a young, very handsome, very nice guy. He was a Taiwanese national. And he was like 24 years old. And he was living in like a $4 million house in Miami and driving Ferraris and Mercedes Benzes. And what had happened with him was he had gone to the closing of a warehouse.
Mm-hmm.
Was trying to purchase a warehouse for like $3 million. And he showed up with like 675 postal money orders at the close. And that caused the entire, closing to come to a halt. And the bank was kind of greedy and was like, hey, listen, we want to sell this property. You need to get this in order and come back later. So someone in the closing became my informant on that case. So 10 days later, the closing went through, but now I had this large, vast amount of information. So I started working this individual. And this case, in and of itself, it took me all through Miami, and then it took me to King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. And eventually I ended up in Malibu, California with this case. And as I got closer and closer to him, he kept feeling the heat more and more. So he started trying to move his business, move his assets, and he also tried to move himself physically from Miami. So he ended up in Malibu. So I ended up in Malibu,
Mm.
and we're out there, and I had to come back to Miami, and then he uprooted from Malibu and relocated to Houston, Texas.
Mm.
And in Houston, leaving his office one night, he caught 2 bullets in the chest and one in the head,
Wow.
and he was killed before he reached like 28 years of age. And he had obviously transgressed somebody the wrong way. It's still an unsolved homicide in Houston, but we pretty much know because of his lifestyle. So that case was pretty interesting because of the travel involved, because it had a whole bunch of multinational um, people. There were Hispanics involved, there were Americans involved, there were Taiwanese people involved, there were computer chips coming in from Seattle, Washington, there were parts of handguns coming in through Vancouver. So it was a very multinational but multi faceted case.
Oh, that's interesting. That's pretty cool. I love listening to your cases, the ones that you can reveal, obviously. So you mentioned during that case, particularly moving money around, right?
Right.
So like currently, like what have you seen as far as money launderers? How are they moving money around?
Well, 9/11 kind of changed the air travel for all of us, and they
Mhm.
created the TSA, which, as we know, stands for thousands standing around. It created TSA, and so the physical muling of cash on airplanes got kind of curtailed
Mhm.
as people were strapping currency under their clothing or to their body, and in suitcases and such. So money started to stockpile. So they became more engaged in the digital world.
Mhm.
And what a lot of people kept in suitcases and moved from car to car, they started now parceling out, as we know, smurfing into banks and things like that. So a lot of money launderers have actually become very global.
Mhm.
They're recognizing what countries are friendly to them and what countries are not. Um, so we've seen that more so, and a lot of local task force officers are finding themselves stymied because their budgets and their leadership does not allow them to be as flexible as the money launderers are. In my case, in my day, I had very strong leadership, and I had also lots of flexibility. And there were plenty of times that we saw someone pull up into Miami International Airport, and just one of us went in, bought an airline ticket, and got on the airplane with the guy and went to wherever he was going.
Right.
So, they don't really have that latitude, I think, anymore.
Mhm.
So there's almost like you're stuck at the dock watching the ship sail away. Um, Also, the thing that's generating money is changing too. Like, we've seen there had been a lot of money laundering going through casinos, but now we're seeing a lot of online betting. We're seeing a lot of
Mhm.
people are literally watching NFL football games, sitting on their couch and betting with a cell phone in their hand. So
Mhm.
that's been taken kind of away from there a little bit. And also the advent of fentanyl and other lab created drugs is changing the dynamics of money laundering too.
Hmm. Now I have a curious question, actually, too. One, I can't imagine carrying cash on a plane. I mean, it has to be a sizable amount, and it sounds so uncomfortable. But how much can you actually strap onto your body and carry onto a plane?
A person your size is well, first of all, you would put on a pair of women's pantyhose, and Justin, I know you're familiar with this. You put on a pair of women's pantyhose, then you take a second pair of pantyhose, and as you start to put on the second pair, you start to push the currency in between the two pairs of pantyhose.
Hmm.
So a person of your size under a suit and tie, you could probably carry about 160,000 if the bills are large enough, and no one's going to notice the difference
Oh, that's interesting. Hey, I'm not going to try it. I don't feel comfortable wearing pantyhose.
anymore.
Um, yeah, yeah, good point. Um, so the other question kind of piqued my interest is like the money laundering safe havens, like the countries that are friendly. Like, I guess this day and age, what countries are still friendly to money launderers? Maybe that's not the best terminology.
No, it's not that they're friendly. It's that you have to recognize that we're all in this economic spin
Hmm.
globally. And certain countries have large GNPs, and other countries just don't have the resources. They may not have the population, the resources, or the egress to become a large GNP, and they have to rely on something to survive. So
Right.
this essentially make them money laundering friendly. It makes them how are we going? It makes them more survivable. Is what they're doing. So
Right.
their attitude is we don't care what you say in Washington, D.C., or we don't care what you say in London, or we don't care what you say in Ottawa. We, the island of such and such, or we, the country of such and such, need to survive ourselves. It's
Mm.
your enforcement and your problem is your problem. That's not our issue. I can tell you, I've been to certain islands in the Bahamas where there's literally a bank, maybe the size of like a backyard shed at the end of the runway,
Wow.
and the airplane lands, and as we turn, quick deposit,
Mm.
airplane goes right back out again. I mean, so you could look at the Bahamas, which is over 775 different islands.
Mm.
Very hard to enforce. Isle of Man.
Yeah.
And there are just certain countries that just need to do what they need to do to live and to survive.
Mm. That's
So
it.
it becomes more like a moral issue or a value issue. And if your value equation is not the same as what policymakers are saying in Washington or like I said, London, then that's just a value equation. That's all it is.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it's great to hear your experience, you being on the ground and you being involved. So I got a good question for you. Now they'll like listen, our future AML detectives that are listening out there, you know, everything we do, we measure our performance, right? We try to correct what we did wrong or we could do better, gaps, opportunities. Is there a particular case that you worked on, or any case for that matter, where you evaluated your performance and you knew you could have done certain things better, or you attributed to the next case?
It's not so much a matter of doing something better. It's a matter of you didn't check all the boxes.
Right.
We had a case one time where this guy was loading currency into large speakers. Once
Mm.
again, I'm dating myself, but there was a time when we had stereo systems had speakers so big that you had to move out of your own house. They were so large. And and so we see him leaving his house with these large speakers, and intercepted him and found I think we found maybe 1.25 million in the speakers,
Mm.
crammed into the speakers. And if we go back to the house to serve a warrant, and my agency was solid, and my unit was solid, but the agency that was part of our task force was having some political infighting.
Mm.
So their leadership, as we would say in police work, their brass, their leadership actually came out on the scene that day, and those detectives are like, see, this is what we do, and this is why we
Mm.
can't have our budget cut, and this is why we got to keep Johnny, and this is why I still need to have a Corvette, and they were arguing, for their survival,
Mm.
and in doing so, they kind of overtook the searching of the house. Well, if you don't know what you're looking for, you're not going to understand things.
Right.
And just like everything in life, there's a certain language, and there's a language, and there's a tribalism, and there's a nuance to money laundering, just like there is to auto theft, just like there is to being an NFL quarterback, just like
Mm.
there's being an NBA guard. You have a certain cadence of what you do that the
Mm.
people around you understand. And if you break up that cadence, then you have misinformation or disinformation. So in
Got it.
this case, one of those detectives found a piece of paper with an address on it and didn't tell anybody, but he didn't think it was important. So the case had happened around noon or 1 p.m., but in typical local news, they had a breaking story at 11 p.m. It's
Mm.
just then I was home in bed,
Yeah.
and I get a phone call from my station, telling me that some person is calling them frantically saying he's here, he's here, he's here,
Mm.
and they didn't know what they're talking about, so they gathered it was something to do with me. So and what it was this woman was watching the local news, and she watched the guy that we had intercepted 1.5 million from pull up in a taxi that night and unload 7 duffel bags from that address that was on that piece of paper. So yes, we seized about $2 million, but we missed about 7 million.
Wow. Wow.
So this is what happens when you don't understand what you're looking at or what you're doing.
Yeah.
This type of the money laundering world is not for the faint of heart. You know, people in television and movies portray people constantly being killed over cocaine deals, but the truth of the matter is they're being killed for what the cocaine represents, and it's cash.
Right.
I see that beautiful plant behind you, and as you know, cocaine, for all intents and purposes, grows on bushes. It grows on a cocoa bush, and every time you see kilograms of cocaine, you can just go back to the bush and pull more leaves. You
Right.
can't go to the money tree. So money investigations, financial investigations have a whole different cadence and rhythm to them than actual, hey, you're in a stolen car, get out of the stolen car type mentality.
Very cool. Well, listen, Mike, it's been a pleasure to have you on for this episode.
Sure.
I've learned a great deal, and I hope everybody listening. I mean, the investigative techniques, the cases, very interesting. I hope you can come back another episode.
I hope so too.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mike.
All right.